Okay. Reintroduce yourself. All right. So my name is Dr. Michelle Hardy. I'm a graduate teaching assistant program manager for the university here. And I have been teaching for about 20 years. I've taught with marine science. I got my degree here at USC in marine science, actually. And then I moved on, did science for a while, and realized I love to teach. And so one of the things that I really love to do is to help not only new graduate students, but faculty learn better methods of teaching. So let me ask you guys, have y'all had official training of how to teach yourself? Like a pedagogy course? You have?
Some.
What field are you in?
Higher education.
Okay.
But got some of it through Teaching University 101,
Okay.
Teaching University 401,
Excellent.
some of those kind of courses.
Yep. So typically, we don't have, unless we're in education, most people don't know the appropriate ways to teach and to get students to be engaged. And so that's what we're going to talk about today is one of those pedagogies called active learning. So have y'all heard of active learning before? Yes, I hope you have. Not really? Okay. Active learning? Yes, sort of? Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to do active learning as we learn about active learning. And I think that's, I'm going to give you a lot of examples. So I think that really what you're going to see is that there is some basic principles of active learning. You'll hear about this if you do any of the reading on it. One of the ways that I'll introduce it to you is kind of a unique way. And then give you examples of how to do it in your class, what it looks like, some examples you can take with you, maybe even a little, if we have time at the end, a little chance for y'all to just kind of brainstorm about what y'all can do in your own classroom. So let me go ahead and have y'all just tell me what departments you're in currently. Have you started? Honors College, excellent.
Exercise science.
Exercise science.
Psychology.
Psych.
Student affairs in the planning, assessment, and innovation area.
Excellent, okay.
Pathology at the medical school.
Excellent. Awesome. What a diverse group. That is awesome. So, okay, so what we'll do is I hope that we can have, since we're a small group, we can have a lot of conversations of what works for y'all, what y'all have seen since we are such a diverse group. It will be neat to hear what other departments have done in the past. So you guys have your slides. I'm a fan of giving people the content so you can listen and you can think. I think that's a very important part of learning is not having to scribble everything down. But I wanted to show you guys some of the comments that people have said about active learning. It's been around for decades, and so it feels like just in the last 10, 15 years max, higher education is like, oh, this is a really good idea. It's been in K through 12 for a very, very, very long time. And so this is from 1982. All genuine learning is active. When you're actually working with it, you're trying to reinforce it in your memory. Basically, your student is trying to learn, but also put that into the brain so that it becomes part of their understanding. Basically, this is 1989. Students who passively expect to absorb ideas in lecture remember nothing. One ear and out the other. I know I was that way in college. I would sit there and scribble everything and remember nothing that I wrote, essentially, and that ages me significantly. But, and then this one, this is a very short 4-page article in a bulletin back in 1987 that what they did, Chicory and Gamson, took a whole bunch of research on undergraduate education and discovered that the best way for students to learn is to do it actively. This is called the 7 Principles of Good Practice in Undergrad Education. It is kind of the Bible, essentially, of how students learn. It is still used today. And then the final one is Native American proverb. Classic, this is what active learning is. Tell me, I'll forget. Show me, involve me, I'll actually understand and remember. Okay, so it's been around. So what I want you guys to do is thinking about, and you have some paper. Let's see, you can do it on the back. I meant to get you guys a piece of paper, but you can do it on the back of, let's see. You can do it on your, right now, I'll get y'all some cards in a second, but you can do it on your notes here. But think about a class or workshop that you really learned something difficult, you learned it well, or you didn't learn anything at all. And what was that class like? What do you think was the reason for that? So I'll give you all about a minute to think about that and write some ideas down. Okay, so I let y'all go a little bit longer than I normally do because y'all had a good conversation. What was the kind of threads that y'all were talking about in your group here?
I picked up, you have to spend the time and you have to do the work.
Yeah. And that was a good class? That was one you learned a lot in?
Oh, my example for the good class was my father teaching me how to drive straight road cars and some bread,
Yes.
bump up, and just the time and his patience.
Yeah. And putting in the effort to make things actually work and drive, essentially. Yeah. What else did y'all talk about?
I think being able to recognize what resources are available to you, but also collaborating with others, because when you can kind of get yourself to a point that then seek out additional thoughts and whatnot from others, you start to learn even more, and you learn together, which I think brings up a bigger conversation and more learning than just maybe doing it on your own.
Well, and that's actually a very important part of active learning is knowing that you don't know and that you have to go find out that information. Yeah, good. What about y'all? What about y'all's group? What'd y'all write or what'd y'all talk about? I said several things.
Well, we talked about that students do better when they think that something is important. If you can impress upon somebody the idea that this is going to be on the exam, and in med school and law school, the exam is a really big thing at the very end.
Yes.
They will pay more attention.
Well, in fact, yes, we brought that up, but I'm just saying from experience teaching at the med school, it makes me sad at times that we're getting to the point there because of how high stakes the board exams are becoming for them to then get a residency.
Yeah.
Because if they don't get a residency, they don't continue in the career.
Yeah.
Right? That everything is directed on, is this on the board exam? If not, I get on the student evaluations, take that out of your lecture because it's not on the boards.
Wow.
Okay? They're becoming more and more, and I'm getting more and more sad about my job here at the school. They're becoming more and more and more one-dimensional.
Yeah. Consumerism, really. Do I need to know it? If not, you're wasting my time.
And money. Yeah, I really had difficult time about that. Yeah, the main problem with my student was that she was not clear what is in the exam or what is not.
Yeah.
They were all connected.
Yeah.
And even I ended up telling them, okay, this chapter and these pages are very important, but you cannot just read half of the book, like somewhere in the middle and just.
Absolutely. Yeah.
This was what they wanted, exact pages.
Yep.
From this page, from this paragraph, and I had professors that they did that. Just say, just this page, and you really didn't understand, but you could memorize, you could pass, and that's it.
But then you said something about when students came back and they had to do research and they actually were going out and needing to do research, they started seeing the connections that they didn't see before. Was that correct?
Well, yes, basically. I mean, I teach legal research, which is not something that is really tested on the bar. The bar tests rote knowledge of substantive law areas. But once you get out into practice, you have to, a problem comes in, you have to research it. And we're teaching them sort of the practical hands-on stuff. It's not part of the bar exam, and it's not frequently not until their first summer when they go out and do clerkships and they start to see how they have to actually use the knowledge they have that they realize that what we are teaching them is important.
Yeah.
I have certainly had students come back, after that first summer who said, now I get it.
Yep.
Now I see what you were trying to show us.
Yeah.
And trying to get them to understand that earlier would be wonderful.
So y'all have all touched on some really important aspects of what we're actually going to address with active learning strategies. One thing I heard with respect to what you were just saying, getting them to see that this is when they come back and say, I wish I had known this was really helpful, is actually having prior students come and tell your class the first day of class this is what happened. This is why you need to pay attention, not just to the rote memorization, but this, and this. And so I have heard that that's been a very successful way of doing things, of getting them to not just want to know what's going to be on the boards, essentially. So good. So what active learning is, basically we talked about it. You're going to get students doing things to help them learn better. That's the whole point of active learning. And then not only doing the things, but thinking about it. Why did I do it this way? How is it going to impact my learning later on? Do I need to do other learning to understand what I'm doing? And you're essentially helping students construct their own learning. And that's a hard part because you're making them think about, this is what I need to know, not just facts in, facts out. So that's a big part of what active learning is designing activities to make that actually happen. And we'll look at that. And then active learning doesn't have to be in the classroom. Of course, you can have all sorts of different experiences that are types of active learning, but I think what we can do is just be aware that there are all sorts of different variations on active learning. It doesn't have to be technology. It doesn't have to be pen and paper. All sorts of different types of strategies, and I will introduce many of those to y'all today. So what's wrong with lecturing?
It's very one directional.
One directional, exactly. Information in, hopefully the students can regurgitate it. Very efficient. You have the time throughout the semester. You have the control over the time and the control over the content. And particularly professors like to be able to do that because they have all this information they have to get across for things like boards and final exams. But the problem is that and this is from Gray literature, but the average length, and there's different numbers out there, what's the average length of the adult attention span where they listen and then their mind wanders and then they come back? How long would that be? 3 to 5. I've heard 3 to 5. I've heard 10 to 15. What I've heard is about 10 to 15 minutes. And so it depends on the situation, depends on the content, of course, but it doesn't mean that I only have 10 to 15 minutes of y'all's time. So within this hour and 15 minutes, your mind will wander at least 4 times. And that's natural, that's normal. And so what you can then do is structure your class to take advantage of that because students need those breaks because their mind is wandering. That's totally fine. Brain psychologists will tell you that's the best thing to do is to schedule and develop your class that way. But the problem with lecturing is that you're not getting the lasting reinforced learning. Because you guys, I'm sure when you have straight lectures, you remember it all after the end of the day. Could you have taken an exam the next day and been able to make 100? Probably.
Depends on the subject.
Depends on the subject, yes. So what you have to then do is reinforce it by studying, by rereading, by practicing. That's active learning, okay? So with lectures, students are, as you mentioned, this is a passive role. They are listening to you, basically information in, you're expecting, or the students are expecting the professor to organize it for them, tell them how to think about it instead of the way that you tell students how to think about it is the way you think about it, not necessarily the way that they can process it or think about it. And so you're basically, they are being stenographers is one way to think about that. They're basically transferring what you say to a piece of paper. So there's something called the forgetting curve. Have y'all heard of the forgetting curve? Some of y'all have? Okay, so what this is, essentially is research that was done that shows how long it takes for basically how much percentage of your memory to be lost of a particular topic. So there's days here, percent retention of the content. You can see after 1 day, 50% of what you learned is gone. 1 day, 50%. 2 days. Basically, we're doing a logarithmic curve here. And so it kind of tapers off at the end. And this is something that has been shown and supported through researchers over time. So this forgetting curve is what you try to prevent and improve on with active learning. That's what the whole point of active learning does, is to help reinforce that content in your students' minds. So again, this is an exponential time. So the best time to get students to reinforce that material when there's more of that knowledge there, so they're not having to spend more time studying, is as quickly as possible and regularly, okay? And I'll come back to this in a little bit. We'll talk a little bit more about this. So active learning, there's a couple key elements, and we're going to address several of these. It is using creative thinking activities, critical thinking activities. And people think creative, critical thinking activities are hard to develop. Well, not really. You all are experts in your field. You can think about, this would be a cool idea to do in class. How can I do this in class? That's what you want to do, because that is what students will see as an interesting way to learn it. They are actively engaged with it, constructing this knowledge, their own knowledge, and they're taking responsibility. And that's what y'all have been talking about. How do I get students to take responsibility of my own learning and not just tell me what I need to know? And that, I think, with active learning, helps them to see the value of taking responsibility of their own learning, okay? And then they're just thinking about a deeper understanding, what they just did. What did I have to do to learn this? What were some things I had to practice? Skill development, that's what part of active learning is. And another component of active learning is the social aspect. A lot of students don't like to work with others because they've been on their screens their whole life, and that's fine, but that's what you're working with now. So getting them to develop those social skills is kind of part of our jobs now. Okay, so the research shows with active learning, they will have improved comprehension. They will have retention of knowledge, longer retention of knowledge. And there are hundreds of studies that are showing this. Increased conceptual understanding, and I'll show how this works in a second. Higher order thinking skills. Metacognition, what's metacognition?
Thinking about thinking.
Thinking about thinking. How do I learn? What do I have to do? Can I just reread, or do I have to go back and review? Those types of things. Increased engagement, teamwork skills. Active learning can be used at all sorts of content and skill levels. Matter of fact, you do more active learning at higher levels of undergraduate courses and graduate students. You should. You should be doing more application-based and higher order thinking in your graduate level skills classes. And then you see that when you teach things, and you guys know this, when you teach things, you really have to learn it in order to teach it. When I first taught physical oceanography, oh my gosh, I had to go back and relearn so much because I never thought I had to know it. So I just memorized it for the exam. Worst thing to do ever. So active learning has research that shows that it works, okay? So let me ask, before I move on to this next section, do you have questions on anything? What questions do you have on anything we've talked about so far? Not yet? Yes.
Actually, that's forgetting kind of a bit frightening. So can you tell us a little more about the reference? So, or
I'm going to come back to it.
Population and like.
So it was actually from, yes, that's a really good question. It was actually originally from one professor who literally learned this material and then measured how much he could recall day after day after day. And that was done, he did it many examples, did it multiple times so that there were many examples. It was a sample size of one, but then research later has continued to reinforce that learning curve, the forgetting curve. And so I'm going to talk about how to deal with it in just a little bit. I'll go back over it. Yes.
Oh.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I gave you the websites, and we can look at the website as well and see what they say about it.
Just wonder if there is any review paper.
Oh, that's a good question.
Right, yeah. Because it's really frightening if it's based on one or two studies.
Right. Originally it was, but then that was such an interesting finding that so many other studies supported. Yes, there was a lot more replication. Yes.
I have a question about that forgetting curve.
Okay.
Okay. That seems to be, you're trying to say you're putting the onus on me during the lecture to use active learning to help them forget less during that initial hour of the lecture. That's not how I understand that forgetting. What's happening, at least for my students, a lot of them have very, very poor study skills.
Yes, absolutely.
Meaning I have a certain cohort of the students that binge study the night before the exam. So I have a certain percentage of questions on each interval exam, and I warn them at the beginning of the semester this is going to happen, that are asking you about things from the previous interval, the previous block of exams, long-term retention.
Yep.
They don't do interleave practice. They don't do distributed practice
Yep.
if they're binge studying. So part of the onus here you have to put on the students
Absolutely.
and their report of why that forgetting curve is going like
Yes.
that.
And I didn't mean, you're absolutely right. I didn't mean to say that the forgetting curve is up to you to make that happen. What I will show you is that it is up to the students to know what works for them, what interleave practice is, how to study best for these things to have that long-term memory. And so I will absolutely come back to that point because it's very important. That's actually the third principle of active learning. It's that important. So what I want to do is I'm going to read you a children's book. It's called Fish is Fish. Has anyone heard of this children's book before? By Leo Leone. So Fish is Fish. What this will do is this will introduce to you the 3 principles of active learning in a child's book, all of that. So at the edge of the woods, there was a pond, and there a minnow and a tadpole swam among the weeds. They were inseparable friends. And I'll come over here. One morning, the tadpole discovered that during the night, he had grown 2 little legs. Look, he said triumphantly, look, I'm a frog. Nonsense, said the minnow. How could you be a frog if only last night you were a little fish just like me? They argued and argued until finally the tadpole said, frogs are frogs and fish are fish, and that's that. In the weeks that followed, the tadpole grew tiny front legs, and his tail got smaller and smaller. And then one fine day, a real frog now, he climbed up out of the water and onto the grassy bank. The minnow too had grown and had become a full-fledged fish. He often wondered where his 4-footed friend had gone, but the days and weeks went by and the frog did not return. Then one day, with a happy splash that shook the weeds, the frog jumped into the pond. Where have you been? Asked the fish excitedly. I have been about the world, hopping here and there, said the frog, and I have seen extraordinary things. Like what? Asked the fish. Birds, said the frog. Birds, and he told the fish about the birds who had wings and 2 legs and many, many colors. As the frog talked, his friend saw the birds fly through his mind like large feathered fish. What else? Asked the fish impatiently. Cows, said the frog. Cows. They have 4 legs, horns, eat grass, and carry pink bags of milk. And people, said the frog. Men, women, and children. And he talked and talked until it was dark in the pond. But the picture in the fish's mind was full of lights and colors and marvelous things, and he couldn't sleep. Oh, if he could only jump about like his friend and see that wonderful world. So this is what he saw in his images. The frogs, the fish, the cows, the people, and the birds. And so the days went by, the frog had gone, and the fish just lay there dreaming about birds in flight, grazing cows, and those strange animals all dressed up that his friend called people. One day he finally decided that come what may, he too must see them. And so with a mighty whack of the tail, he jumped clear out of the water and onto the bank. He landed in the dry, warm grass, and there he lay gasping for air, unable to breathe or to move. Help, he said feebly. Luckily, the frog, who had been hunting butterflies nearby, saw him and with all his strength, pushed him back into the pond. Still stunned, the fish floated about for an instant. Then he breathed deeply, letting the clean, cool water run through his gills. Now he felt weightless again, and with an ever so slight motion of the tail, he could move to and fro, up and down as before. The sun rays reached down within the weeds and gently shifted patches of luminous color. This world was surely the most beautiful of all worlds. He smiled at his friend the frog, who sat watching him from a lily leaf. You were right, he said. Fish is fish.
Yeah.
Okay. So 3 principles of active learning were described here. Don't look at your side. What were some of those? What was the obvious one?
Got the lecture, right?
The lecture?
The frog would tell him.
Okay. But
I think learning happens in
Yes.
conversation.
learning happens in conversations, okay. There's another big one.
Questions.
Soloman experienced.
Frog went out and experienced it, and he was able to describe it. What happened with the fish? What did the fish do?
Made a mistake.
He made a mistake. Yeah, absolutely. Well,
Based on his perceptions.
based on his perceptions. He knew what the world was like based on what his experiences was, his preconceptions, his knowledge. So he imagined birds as flying fish, which there are some, but that's different. Or cows that are fish with, pink bags of milk. So what we see, and so the other thing was, if you think of it, well, there's a couple other things. One of the things he didn't realize was that a frog is very different from a fish. Frogs breathe air, fish breathe water. And so he didn't know what he didn't know. He didn't know that there was this whole other thing. He didn't think that, oh, maybe the frog can live in air because he's different from me. So he didn't think about that, of what he didn't know. So these 3 principles, so these takeaway points, one of them is you as the instructor need to engage what they think they know, what they already know. Because a lot of fields, students will have misconceptions that color how they take that new understanding and understand it. And I'll give y'all some examples of how that can go very wrong. So what do your students already know? Then what we call the role of factual knowledge versus concepts, which kind of goes back to what you said, Dan, where you have facts, but unless you know the overarching concept or model, those facts mean nothing. And then vice versa, you can have concepts, but you can't apply it without having additional facts that give you new examples, essentially. So what do they need to know? How do they organize it? How does it all fit together? And then what we call self-monitoring and metacognition importance. What do I need to know in order to learn this better? And so with the fish, it was essentially to be as scientific as possible. He didn't know about evolution. He didn't know that frogs evolved to be able to live on land, fish have not, that sort of thing. So how does a student, what do they need to know? How do they retain the knowledge? How do they learn, continue to learn? Okay? So let's look at these 3 things. Engaging prior understanding. So when you develop your understanding, and y'all do this now, but you already have a very rich background and experiences, your students build that new knowledge on what they already know. And so students have these preconceptions that you really truly have to engage. I always thought when I first started teaching, oh, they'll get it. They'll figure it out. No, they don't. Let me give you an example. So this is a book that, and there's a couple new editions. It's called How Students Learn. This one is Science in the Classroom. There's also history. There's a couple other fields as well. But what they do is they talk about how students learn, what you have to do, what they have to do in order to continue and keep that learning. So this first one talks about how those preconceptions are a barrier to good, new, continual learning. So in this example, students can memorize stuff. I can memorize an equation, but I don't know how to use it in real life. And we all have had that experience. So this example was elementary students versus college physics students learning about momentum. And so I'm just going to read you this little anecdote here. So Andrea DeSessa conducted a study in which he compared the performance of college physics students at a top technological university with that of elementary school children on a task involving momentum. And momentum is basically, say in this example, when you hit something, the momentum is how it slows down, how it speeds up, what happens to it as it moves away, essentially. And that's very simplified. So he instructed both sets of students to play a computerized game that required them to direct an object so that it would hit a target, and when it hits the target, to do so at its most minimum speed. So participants were introduced to the game and given a hands-on trial, and then they were allowed to practice with a wooden mallet to hit the ball. Then DeSessa found that both groups of students failed when they had to actually do it for real. They had the practice one, and then when they had the game actually happen, they did it wrong. So both elementary and college physics. So they both groups applied the force when the object was just below the target. So here your object is going like this. Here's your target. They hit it to hit the target, but not far enough away so that the momentum had time to slow down, essentially, or decrease. So they applied the force when the object was below the target, failing to take momentum into account. Further investigation with one student, college student, revealed that she knew the physical properties and formulas, would have performed very well in the exam, but in the context of the game, she fell back on her untrained conceptions of how actually the physical world works. This is college, okay? So that's one example of how you have to engage what momentum really looks like in the real world and how do you deal with that. So for you as instructors, realize that these perceptions, preconceptions, and misconceptions are hard to change. So you have to give them concrete ways to visualize that. So can y'all think, and I'll just do this, we'll just do this as a group, what's a preconception or misconception that you remember either yourself or in your classes that was hard to make students change their minds or basically be able to think differently about it? I'll think of any.
There is something about personality.
Okay.
That so many people think about personality types and the way we can categorize and put them in blocks. Say this
Yes.
one's type A, type B.
Yep.
And then they say, okay, and then we talk about the big five. They think that, okay, so there are 5 types now. But thinking about people as types and like labeling them, it's wrong.
Absolutely.
So
It is.
this is something that I had kind of difficult time to maybe I don't know. I don't know. I'm very hopeful that they by the end of the semester they realize that it's much more complicated and it's not that simple as say this time, that time, I'm this, and you are that, and yeah.
Well, that's a really
It's a huge misconception.
Yes, that's a really good example because we're actually going to do a similar example. So with learning styles, people think they are a specific learning style, but there are tens and tens and maybe 100 models of what types of actual learning styles there are. The students are like, no, I'm kinesthetic, that's the only way I can learn. No, let me show you some different examples. And then I had them do an exercise to let them see, oh, I really am actually more this side versus this side. Okay, so we'll get to
A
that.
misconception, a classic
Yes.
misconception I've had with students. I teach them bone pathology, diseases of bone.
Oh, cool.
So there's a group of those diseases that have to do with bone remodeling. One of their tremendous misconceptions is that bone is static. That our bones are dead. They're static.
Yeah.
They never change. So to introduce the concept to them, I play them a film clip of the old 1932 Frankenstein movie where he goes, "It's alive, it's alive, it's alive." And then I hit them with the slides of the living bone and how it's remodeling.
Yeah.
Because they have that misconception. And unless I can get rid of that, they won't understand the diseases I'm going to talk to them about.
Wow.
Osteoporosis in elderly women, Paget disease in elderly men.
Yep.
That all have to do with the fact that the bone is making a mistake in its remodeling.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. That reminds me of a movie called Gattaca. Did anyone ever see Gattaca? It's about 20, 25 years old. And y'all remember when they, in order to make him taller, they had to sever his legs and pull it apart so that the bone would then grow? I never realized that's what bones did until I watched that movie. Exactly the same thing. And so you need to have something fundamental like that showing you this is why it's wrong. You know, this is the what actually does happen. And so that's where you're really truly engaging that prior belief, that prior understanding. Okay, yes, sir.
The misconception that springs to my mind is the students will come into a research class, they already know how to do it.
Yes.
And then there's
Yep.
another misconception kind of from the other side that you're young, you already know how to do computer stuff.
Yes, that's a very good point. And they don't. Yes.
And both of them are frequently wrong. But if you're the youngest lawyer in a law firm, the older partners will always look for you for how do I make this technology work?
And then that older person is not realizing I'm going to have to figure it out myself anyway, basically. Good example. Okay. So in your class, what you do is you think about, you know your knowledge, you know your field. What are some of those misconceptions or preconceptions that you have to really get students to engage? So in the case of biology, when someone asks you how do plants feed, what would you think the students will say? How do plants feed?
Photosynthesis.
You have biology. Well, what else would they say? What else do you think they would say? From where? From the roots.
Yeah.
But that's not how they feed. That's how they get nutrients and water, but they feed by they make their own food that they store in the cells by photosynthesis. And so they don't think about those things. So what you want to do is produce these activities to get them to think about those misconceptions or preconceptions. So I've given you my favorite packet of all called Interactive Techniques. There are 186 different types of active learning strategies for different styles of teaching, whether it's lecture, small class, large class, student pairs, student groups, Twitter, Facebook, so many things. So I pulled out a couple of them. 1 minute paper number 32. I'll come back to the affective response in a second. But essentially number 32, if you look at that, they just write on a question that you have. And I like to do, don't just what did you learn, but ask them a question about a preconception and see what they do know. And then you can have a really rich discussion. Okay, this is actually what it is, and really start to get into it that way. Number 16, make them guess, where you introduce a new subject by asking them a question or telling them a really cool story that gets them to think about what they already think about bone, for example, and have them start talking about how they actually understand something so that you can then engage that and get them to think about it differently. And then number 23 at the bottom of that page, background knowledge probe. And that one, you just set up a questionnaire. And that one, we're actually going to do kind of a version of it in a little bit to show you how much preconceptions there are and how people study. Okay. So any questions on the first principle that we talked about? Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am.
An
Yes.
example about how do plants feed is a very good one. Can you elaborate a little more connecting to the topic of this workshop?
So yes, so what students mostly think is that plants eat by pulling stuff into their roots. And what you want them to do is realize, no, that's not how plants feed. What do you need to eat? And so asking them questions. For any organism to live, they have to be able to burn sugars to get energy. You can't burn oxygen and get energy from it. You can't burn, well, CO2 sort of. But you have to have sugars and fats and burn those to release the energy to feed and do metabolism. And so what this does is gets them to think about what's actually coming up in the roots versus what's being formed in the cells for photosynthesis.
Right. But in terms of learning, it's kind of like they want to take everything from the professor or from the book. And it's like just using or thinking that it's the roots, but they need to really analyze that, and they need to learn how they can learn in terms of active learning. So be an active learner.
Yeah. So what I'm saying here is that you first have to say, what do you already think? Because I can tell you that plants feed by photosynthesis, and that will go one in the ear and out the other. I can answer that question, but I don't actually understand what is happening in photosynthesis. And that's why you get them to start thinking about those preconceptions. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, good. The second one, developing competence, they have to know both facts and the model, the structure. And so you have this deep foundation of factual knowledge, and I'm going to go over these steps in a second, but then also how these facts fit into the bigger concepts of your field. And doing that using example after example after example, because one example does not address all the possibilities, I think. And then when you're given facts, how you then categorize them with respect to those concepts. Whole bunch of facts in your brain, you're not going to remember them unless you know how they relate to others. And then how to apply that to new experiences. So I have this concept, I have these facts. Now let's do real life, real application, how it actually works. And so this idea of facts and concepts are actually very closely intertwined. One example is this example of darts and water. And what happened with this was basically how you learn a procedure, how you learn facts versus how you learn with understanding. Two groups of children practiced throwing darts at a target underwater. One group received an explanation of refraction, and so this is your refraction. Basically, as light comes from air into water, you're going into two different densities, and what that does is that density shifts the light wave and refracts it and bends it, and so it makes it look like something is a different position because the light is refracted, that light ray is. So students were given, one received an explanation of refraction of light, which causes the apparent location of the target to be deceptive. The other only practiced dart throwing without the explanation. Both groups did equally well in the practice test, which involved a target 12 inches underwater, but the group that had been instructed about the abstract principle did much better when they had to transfer to a situation when the target was under only 4 inches of water, because they understood what they were doing and why it would shift. The group that received the instruction about refraction could then apply and adjust their behavior to the new task. So it's both the facts and the overarching concept. So another example. This is fun. I'm gonna read this to you. Last Cerny, Flingeldove and Pribben were in the birdlink, treppering gloopy caples and cleaning burly greeps. Suddenly a ditty strazzled boot into Flingeldove's trust. Pribben glaped. Oh, Flingeldove, he chided, that ditty strazzle is tunning in your grap. So let me ask you some questions. When did Flingeldove and Pribben trepper? Y'all tell me. Last Cerny. What kind of caples did Flingeldove and Pribben treppen? Y'all agree? Loopy. What did the ditty strazzle do to Flingeldove's trusk? Boof. I know, this is like Greek to me. Boof. It did. It boofed into. All right, next question. What was Pribben's reaction? Yeah, he glapes. Okay. All right. What do you imagine happened next? What happened next in the story? I have no idea. Freaking no idea. All right. Well, based on the incidents in the story, why do you think Flingeldove and Pribben went to birdlink in the first place, and are they likely to return? Why or why not? I have no freaking idea. Because you don't know the overarching model or concept behind this. You can answer the facts, but you don't know the main idea, the main point. And so this is what some of your students may say, oh, I can read this, give you answers, but I had no idea. It's Greek to me. No idea what you're talking about. Yes, sir.
It's not just facts.
No, it's not.
We are applying our understanding of English grammar as a subset of rules to pull out the answers that we can get.
Yes.
Because the words don't have meaning.
Exactly.
It's only their position.
Right. And so you can just get the fact, but then you still don't have what is the whole point of this? What was the point of the story? What should I have taken away from the story aside from just the facts? So that's why knowing the concept of this behind the story is what the students also have to know. Does that make sense? Let me give you some more examples, okay? So you have to know, can only apply what they learned. Whatever they learned in this, they can only apply it to what might happen in the future if they actually know what the story was about in the first place, okay? So they have to learn about it, understand it first in order to apply it. So it's not just facts versus big ideas, it's both. You have to have both parts of that for learning. Remembering the facts is enhanced, so you can remember facts better if you know the big picture, because you know how things relate to each other. And the concept, you know the concepts in the big picture, you understand it better and better when you have more examples and more facts to help really elucidate it and make it more rich in your understanding. Okay? So in your class, do this by talking about how they will see this in different examples, different experiences, different situations. Analogies, examples. More analogies you can give and examples you can give, the more richer understanding your students will have of that topic, of those concepts. So an example I like to use is with marine science. This is If you look at this, this is a air pressure, a low pressure system like a storm. And the way all the physical forces work is that with that low pressure, the winds will start to move around in a circle. They start to move from your higher pressure to your low, but then because of other forces, they start to go clockwise. This is a fundamental principle of how things move on Earth. So when I then start to introduce how currents work, I say, I'm showing you this image because this is exactly what happens with currents, because it's the same thing, moving of some type of fluid on the Earth's surface. And so it's much easier for them to understand how currents move because they've already learned the concept with air, okay? Some examples that you can use. 38, number 38. What's the principle? So after recognizing a problem, the students assess the principle in order to solve it. So it helps them figure out that there are types of things where they can apply facts to these general ideas, these general concepts. Application to major, if you teach non-majors, this is why do I need to know this? And then one of my favorites, blender, number 93. So if you look at number 93, blender is an example where you have them essentially write or brainstorm parts of an idea or topics that are involved in this concept. And then what they do is they go into groups. Two of them integrate their two parts of the concept, and then they get with another pair, the four integrate, and they start seeing how all those concepts blend together into the bigger picture. And so it really helps them to kind of think about different aspects that they would not have otherwise. Okay? Third one, importance of self-monitoring. Metacognition. I wish I had known about metacognition when I was an undergraduate. It would have helped so much.
Ditto.
So basically, what do I need to do in order to learn and remember? Okay? So what you want to do, this is actually something that I think is important to teach because students don't know. They think, just tell me what I need to know. I'll remember it. I only need to cram the night before and I'll remember it. It doesn't work that way because that's not the way our brain works. So helping them learn how to learn. Let me give you an example. Students who were directed to use self-explanation while solving math problems actually developed better, deeper conceptual understanding than those that did not. And there's several studies that show that. So as they described and explained to them what they were doing to solve it and why, they actually understood the bigger picture of how those problem sets worked versus not doing it.
Somewhat related, I think, to what you were saying in terms of teaching people how to research.
Yeah.
That you like to know the process because the answer isn't always as important as the process is how I connect those two ideas.
Yeah, I agree.
So with a math problem, what you're like having them do is saying, I'm dividing by X because then I can use this principle and it goes outside the,
Yeah.
But they're talking to themselves. while
Or
they're doing it.
writing it out. That's another one where you actually have them record the steps in like a journal as they go through their understanding of some concept, yes. Because it makes them verbally describe and explain to themselves the reason why, the reasoning, the actual logic and critical thinking behind it.
Which takes time.
It does.
But it's where that short-term memory converts to long-term memory.
Exactly.
It's the active process of
Exactly.
doing that.
It really helps to reinforce that. It's not just superficial plug and chug, essentially. It's not that, okay? So how's your metacognition? I'm going to give you guys a passage. I'm going to put it up here. What I'm going to do is have you guys rephrase it. But what I want you to do is as you're reading it, think about how you're trying to understand it. What was that about? How, when you were reading through it, so I don't care what you read as in what the meaning of it was, what did you do in order to understand what you were reading in your brain? What are you doing right now?
Paying attention to the parts of the capital.
Yeah. The grammar parts, the commas of
Structure.
the structure, good. Yep, what were you about to say?
I was just trying to connect, it was reminding me of when somebody's telling you how you're related to somebody.
Mhm.
I'm just trying to connect Grace Plum Buster with the
Mhm.
literary critic.
Yeah, absolutely. What else did y'all do?
I would read part of it, go back
Yes.
and read something else, and then continue on, and then go back and read several things a number of times.
That's right.
Then read the whole thing again
Yes,
to
yes.
kind of put the pieces
Fit
together.
it back. Exactly. You all just did metacognition without realizing it. You knew, good readers typically will reread, back up, look for parts, look for phrasing to understand it. Poor readers who don't know what to do or how to study don't. They will read through it, not pausing, not thinking, like, I didn't get that. I can't do math. You know, that type of thing. And so what you want with your students is to get them to think about, what do I do to study this topic or this field in order to better understand it and remember it better. So in your class, there's a couple ways you can do this. So number 11, we have self-assessment of ways of learning, where you have students think about, what is, and here it's learning styles, and so it's a little bit outdated, but what do they do in order to learn best? Have them think about that. And then I will show you what I then do after that. Course-related self-confidence surveys. I like this one because what this does is it has students think about what is it that they think that they don't know in this class. And I teach non-majors a lot of marine science. And so they're like, I can't do math, I can't do science. I'm like, it's only because you haven't had a good teacher. Me. So, and then when they go away from the class, they're like, oh, I really actually didn't realize I loved science. And that's what you want to do. It's not because I'm a good teacher, it's how I know how to teach science well. Okay? So what I want to show you is you're going to do a little quiz. And this is based on a paper in 2013 by Dunlosky. And what he did was he summarized the research out there on what student study strategies work well. Have you done this before? Okay, good. So what I want you guys to do is I'm going to explain to you these different types of study strategies. And you're going to tell me, you're going to write in the first column what you think its effectiveness is. If it is high, medium, or low. So you'll put a 2 if it's highly effective in studying, a 1 if it's moderate, and a 0 if it's very poorly effective for studying. So for highlighting is low. And what you're going to do is subtract, figure out what your points are. So if you said highlighting was high and it's actually low, there's a 2-point difference there. So you'll have 0 points if you were off by 2. If you were off by 1, so say you said it was medium but it's actually low, you give yourself 1 point. If you're correct, you said it was low and it is low, you get 2 points. Okay?
So 0 is low.
0 is low.
Sorry,
0 is wrong.
2, 1, 0.
Yeah, so 2 is correct. 1 is you were off by 1. 0 is you were off by 2. Okay? So highlighting, the actual rating was low. So if you said it was low, you got 2. If you said it was low. If you said it was high, it's a 0.
Yes.
Yeah.
What I did where you put the numbers,
What
so
you
the
say
high
is-
would be a 2,
Low
medium would be
zero.
1, and
Ah.
low would be 0.
Right.
Yeah. I'll give you the numbers too. No, actually, I don't.
No.
So,
You'll put
yes.
the numbers and the points on it.
Yeah, that's my bad, sorry. I have it different on here. So rereading is a low. So if you said high, 2 points off. You got a 0. Sorry. Self-explanation, moderate. Practice testing, what'd y'all say?
Moderate.
It's actually high. Summarization, what'd you say? Low. Not a good way to study. Elaborative interrogation. What did y'all say? High, medium, low. It's moderate, actually, because you don't always know what to question. Don't always know what you don't know. Imagery, high, medium, low.
Moderate.
Low. Now, it does depend on the field, but if you don't know what the image is, if you're looking at cells and you have no idea what the cells are, it gives you no meaning.
So you're saying it's flying fish.
Yes, exactly. It's flying fish. Looks like what I think it is, but it's not. Distributed practice. High. That is your forgetting curve, okay? Interleaved practice. Also high. And keyword mnemonics?
Moderate.
Low. Because you're just memorizing random words. So add up how many points you got. Did anyone get more than 15? Did anyone get 15 out of 20 or more? 15 out of 20? Nope, no one ever does. So typically, so you'll see, oh, I have a 60%. 12 or better is actually really good when you don't know what the better ways to study is. When I do this in my classes with my marine science or my geology students, maybe a couple cross the 10 barrier. And they're like, oh, I failed. I'm like, no, look at what this was about. You don't know how to study. Now let's talk about the best way to study, okay?
I don't know what.
So they may work for you, but the research shows, because you're also very, very gifted, very intelligent, you know what to do, you know how to take certain things and to make sense of them as you're studying them. Your undergraduates don't.
I don't think I understand the difference between summarization and self-explanation.
Summarization is just the overall, what's the big picture. Self-explanation was going into the details. How does the Krebs cycles work? You know, what are the details of this? Can I explain it to myself so that I understand it? Not just a big picture thing.
And that's not summarization?
No, because summary is like the overall, like you could say it in a sentence type of thing.
So like an example she gave us, it would be, if we looked at that paragraph or the sentence or whatever, can we summarize the context of that actual writing?
Right. Good
Whereas
point.
when we went back and did the self-explanation, it was, how did I think about that process? Like, how did I think about my learning or my in that process? I wasn't trying to summarize the material that was on the screen. I was just trying to summarize or think about what I was doing.
Yeah.
Summarization is like paraphrase.
Yeah, you could. That's another way, paraphrasing it. What is when I read this,
You
what
don't
is,
understand, you just paraphrase.
Yeah.
You just say what is that.
yeah, so what that paragraph was, an author, something, something, something. I don't even remember because I never really think about it.
But still self-explanation is low.
Yeah, because so when you're doing a self-explanation, you're not necessarily knowing whether you do understand it or not, you're just explaining it to yourself, so you may be explaining the wrong idea. Okay? Okay? And I can give you guys, I can send you a PDF of this paper. It's a really good paper. It's a general paper, it's not a research paper. Okay.
So you want us to focus on practice testing, distributed practice,
Interleave. Mm-hmm.
practice,
Yep.
huh?
Yeah, and self-explanation is moderate. Elaborative interrogation is moderate, but you need to think about what's, for the courses you teach, what actually works best with all of those different ones. Students think, why is highlighting bad? First of all, why is highlighting bad?
Because they highlight everything.
Yeah, they highlight everything and they're like, oh, pretty color, pretty color. They're not even reading the words. And they think that that's a really good study strategy, but it's not, okay? Because no one's told them otherwise.
Well, again, it's what you think is important, but then you think everything is important.
Right, exactly, yeah. What is the thing they need to take away? Good. Now, another one, I've shown you this, it takes a while to do, so we're not doing it in this workshop, but this is a learning styles questionnaire based on Felder and Soloman, who are engineering educators, and they developed this model of learning styles based on this research that they do. So when you have some time, it's a 42 question questionnaire. It is dichotomy. So when I think about what I did yesterday, I'm most likely to get a picture or words. Or when I'm learning something new, it helps me to talk about it or think about it. And what this does is it will actually give you a summary of, based on their model, what your learning style is based on their model. I like their model because what it does is it tells your students you are on a spectrum. You are either active or reflective, but not one or the other, somewhere in between. You are sensing or intuitive, somewhere in between, visual versus verbal, and sequential versus global. And so they've done this research to show that learning styles are not static, as we just talked about. You are on somewhere on the spectrum. And then what's even more exciting, I think, about this model is that they can tell students, if you are sequential, this is how you need to study. If you are verbal, this is what you need to do. They give students that information. And what I do with this in some of my smaller classes is I have them do this as an exercise. And I have them give me where they fall on these ranges. And of course, I'm a scientist, so I plot it and show them the diversity of where students actually fall. You are not this, you are not this, you are a range of this. And it's really interesting to see some students think, they think they're either visual or verbal, they're, either active or reflective. The majority of them tend to fall right in the middle of the two. They are not one versus the other. And so this is a really cool example of students seeing that, no, I actually am not just one versus the other. Yes, ma'am?
I just wonder, in thinking about this, if they've assessed the instructors themselves, and seeing what their learning style is, and if that reflects on their teaching style to a point where,
The H's are me.
Oh, okay.
The highest values, and I think this is actually a little bit different, are where the students are highest.
Okay.
And so what I say is, look, sequential means I'm a scientist, essentially, because it's sequential versus global. I like very, very, logical structure versus a global big picture. No, I like to know how things work. And so I have to change my strategy of how I think and teach to match what y'all's needs are. And that's what you should do. And that's what they see, is that's what I'm trying to do for them. Okay?
You're gonna send us that?
Yes. And yeah, I can send you the graph and how it sets it up and all of that stuff. I'll send that to y'all. Okay? All right, so let's go back to the forgetting curve. With this metacognition, what the metacognition does is helps change that curve. So after one day, what you then do is they go back and do that distributed learning, so that pops the curve back up. So they're continuing to keep that curve up day after day as they review. So when the exam happens, the knowledge is still there. Okay? And so that's why distributed learning is so effective. And interleave learning, because you're reinforcing it, strengthening that meaning, strengthening the relevance, repeating, and that's how you get your short-term memory into long-term memory. I mean, that's what the research shows, is that repetition really puts it in there. Okay? Scientific term, puts it in there. Okay? Question on the metacognition or forgetting curve. Yes, sir?
Do we have optimal intervals for these reviews? I mean, you've got it at 1, 3, 6.
I don't know, and I think that website does have some information on that, so I would have to look that up for you.
Just a suggestion that I use, a lot of the medical students, they work in study groups of 4 or 5 students. So when I have some of the struggling ones come in to see me and we sit down, I say, well, in terms of you becoming more aware of how you learn something, a great challenge is if you can turn to one of your study group partners and explain to them the learning element.
Absolutely.
And then they say to you, oh, I'm getting it now. Then you can feel a little more confident that you actually do know the learning element.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's metacognition. It's part of metacognition.
Yes, it is. Right? It's a higher level, because you have to understand it in order to teach it correctly. That someone actually understands it based on their knowledge. Yeah. So in active learning, you are fundamentally getting them to talk to each other, to teach each other, listen to other ideas. You're getting them to hear different perspectives. You're getting them to write in some manner, so they're putting it into their own words. That's really key. And reflect on what they're learning and how they're learning it. Okay? So let's do a couple of techniques really quick. So in this packet, you've got a whole bunch of different types. We've talked about think, pair, share. We did think, pair, share. Some people don't like to do think, pair, share. And I think the reason why is either they haven't had good experiences, or they don't have people in their group that are being effective. So that's why there are 180 plus different other things that you can do. 1 minute paper, this is where you ask them questions. Whatever the question is, just depends on what you want to get out of that. So I'm giving y'all some examples. Here's another type of think, pair, share. So when I teach El Nino in my marine science, it's a very complicated process. And so one student trying to think it through doesn't always get all the major parts. And so I have them do a pair share, where the first person takes 60 seconds to start describing it. Then the second person comes in, either makes some changes, corrects, and then continues it. And then 30 seconds and 30 seconds, person 1 and 2 follow up. And then where are their questions? And then we come back together as a group. And it really helps to have them discuss and learn and teach each other. So that's a pair share. Another one is I have students talk to each other. We talked about how the atmosphere, earth, ocean forms. Talk to each other, explaining it to each other as they go. And so they're reinforcing that and teaching each other. Okay. So normally I would give you guys, so you have a card. I have about 5 minutes. So you have this little card. I was going to have y'all write down what was a new or interesting point that you've learned so far. But you don't have to write it down if you just want to say it out loud. What's something that you've never heard of that you like that you want to look more into or use?
I like this test.
Yeah.
That Soloman Felder.
The model, absolutely. Yep. Take it and do it, absolutely. Anything else?
I think you could make a really interesting, reflective kind of activity around this study skill strategies.
Absolutely.
I teach typically seniors in their last semester, so it'd be helpful if they're going on to grad school. It's a
Yes.
little bit late in the
Yes.
game, but it's still, you could do some really interesting reflection around why.
Absolutely.
Why do you think this is effective, or
Yeah.
why does the research say this is not effective?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I get that from students because I teach marine science honors. For non-majors, I have seniors to freshmen, and seniors like, I wish I'd had this 4 years ago. I'm like, I'm sorry. So absolutely, yeah. Anything else? Yes.
I'm contemplating with the in-class assignments where they have to, go here, do this, asking them also then to write a bit more about why they're doing it.
Absolutely, yes. There is some great examples of that. Number 88 in your packet, lecture reaction. I really like this one, where you have them go into groups after a lecture. Someone is a questioner, so they ask a question. Someone's the example giver or application giver. Someone is the disagreeer, and someone is the agreeer. And so that really helps them to kind of look at what do I know and not know.
What number is it?
Number 88, lecture reaction. And then there was another one that you were talking about that I really liked. Number 6, empty outlines. That one was neat, where they basically are filling in an outline either at the end of class or at the beginning or throughout. So there's really cool examples in here of many of those things.
And what about assessment, like having multiple choices or question papers,
Mhm.
I don't know. Maybe, what are your recommendations?
So let me give you a couple of other examples because for that very reason, yes. Couple of question and answer types, joint pop quizzes. I do that all the time. They get the grade that each other gets, but I give them the opportunity to talk about it, figure it out, and then whatever their answer is the one they both get. And I do that for in-class quizzes as well as short answer in-class assignments too, because they're teaching each other.
And it goes toward the final?
Absolutely,
grade?
yeah. Mhm. Because it's still an assessment. It still shows them what they do and don't know, gets them to talk and think about it, and it really helps to reinforce the material. I do these in every class. I do these types of things, and they're part of the assignments. I have what I call a assignments grade. That's a significant part. It's about 40%, and all of the in-class stuff and then the homework stuff all feed into that.
So you usually have groups, usually assign
Pairs, groups, yeah, whatever they want to do.
Is it something that they stick to that, or it's just?
Yeah, they like to do it. They prefer to work in groups because they don't always know everything and they hear other perspectives too. Yeah. And it's safer for them.
Yeah.
It seems like a trivia team.
Almost, yeah. Because you're,
When they don't know, when they're.
Yeah.
But then you start getting that one person, and everyone's like, oh, you got this.
Yeah.
So then they start routinely turning to that person for an answer.
yeah. And that's why I like to do small groups, is for that very reason. Because one person does always answer. So break them into groups so that that one person is not controlling the conversation. 2s or 3s, yeah. 4 is getting a little big.
I think the additive thing though about 60 seconds, next person 60 seconds, and then let's go to 30, that's sort of
Dividing, the responsibility,
Yeah.
exactly, yep. 1-sentence summary, I like to do this one because the reason why I do this is to show you how different people think. So can someone summarize for me from this workshop who does what, when, where, how, and why? Who can do that? So who's my who? Based on this workshop, this is all the information I'm giving you. Based on this workshop, who does what, when, where, how, and why?
instructors do
Instructors?
things to students.
Okay. What was someone else's idea of who does what? What was something else you were thinking of?
Could be picking up on his point, students do.
Students do something. What else were you thinking of? Some of you are thinking maybe
Colleagues.
colleagues, yeah.
I was thinking, I don't see how that applies to what you're talking about.
Exactly, yeah. So other people think, oh, Michelle gives a workshop to you guys here on, Thursday. And so this simple question, which seems so straightforward to me, I've got 7 answers. And so that's why you need to think about how will my active learning strategies be useful and students will actually get something out of it, okay? And make sure it's clear. That with 1-sentence summaries, this is a good summarization of what someone's doing, especially if you use like case studies or whatever it might be. But I use that just to show you being very specific in the activities that you do. What's the point of them? I wanted to show you what a concept test is. This basically is, and you can go back and read this, a quiz question as you go through the class. It was developed especially for sciences, but what you can do is you can use it not just to ask basic content, but have them think about something. What will happen with this reaction type of thing. Here is my old school concept check. Okay, let's review. What is the tides that we just talked about that gives us eclipses? What is it that gives us highest tides? And they always say, no, it's spring. And then when you have spring tides, what is the moon opposite going to give you also high tide? So that's a concept check during the class itself. Very simple, very easy, reinforcing what you're trying to get them to learn. A couple of other ones that I like to do and I have seen work really well. Concept maps. Has anyone done concept maps before? Why were they helpful? Kind of images, pictures, but showing connections.
I think it's the connections between, in my case, in and out of the classroom.
Absolutely.
kinds of things.
Yep. One of the best examples I've seen of concept mapping was I saw a biology professor do actually Krebs cycle and photosynthesis using Post-its. And she told them, brainstorm all the parts of Krebs and photosynthesis. Now go put those sticky notes in the structure on the wall. And they understood how everything fit together with these very complex photosynthesis cycles. Very cool. And that's an example of brainstorming on the board where students work together. And again, what you can do is you can use these to help them learn the material. You can give them participation grades, but you're still getting them to think about it and learn about it. And then that participation in the activity can be part of their grade. That's totally fine.
Are you using iClicker?
These would be in small classes that I would do that. I also do use iClicker too, yes. And I had them work, whenever I use iClicker, I let them talk to each other and work together. I'm fine with that because that helps them reinforce it. Yep. And they still don't, if they don't know it, they still don't know it, So here's an example of a cooperative group that I do where I have Post-its, big Post-its, 6 different stations around the room. We're talking about plate tectonics. On one Post-it is the continental drift. Second one, C4 spreading, divergent, convergent. On all those different Post-its, students go to each station and write down what they know about that concept. When they go to the next station, they do the same thing, but they can't write anything that's already there. So they have to review what's already there talk about what is not there and then write that down and have those conversations. Works really well. I've had students, when I do this, they're like, I really liked doing that. Because they're up, they're talking, they're really thinking deeply about the content. Okay? I'm gonna skip over affective response. So just a couple of more things. The obstacles I think that people worry about, I don't have time to cover everything. How can I use active learning? Well, the thing you need to think about is that students will not remember everything. So what are my big points that I want to make sure they do remember? What are the things, yes, they're going to see on their boards, but are they going to have to go back when they study and get those smaller details? So how can I then teach them the more important aspects of learning, making the connections, okay? How long it takes to develop the strategies. Those strategies are out there. You can Google active learning medical or active learning bone cells or something, and I bet something will pop up because people have done these and have put them online. It's all out there. Larger class sizes, there are different ways to do different active learning for different sizes. And so that packet I gave you talks about small groups versus large groups, ones that work better. Consistency in learning, so making sure students are all getting the same thing, and that's why smaller groups is better, pairs and threes. Bigger they are, the more likely a student is just going to ride the coattails, essentially. Instructor attitudes, I have great lectures. Okay, you have great lectures, but are your students learning? That's not the point. It's not about you, it's about your students. And then maybe you just don't have the support, which is not uncommon. But also student resistance. Students will say, why are we doing this? Just tell me what I need to know. Will you remember it? How are you going to study? Research shows you will remember better, learn it better, remember it longer, do better in the class with these strategies. Okay. Tons and tons of research out there, as I was mentioning. Just Google, your field, what you're trying to teach. It will talk about, you'll find that information out there. And so I've given you a list of what to do and how to implement this. So the last thing in your packet is planning the actual activity. So these are the things to think about when you go back and start thinking about your class that you may or may not be teaching, this semester. Is that active learning strategy going to be useful? And what I really want you to think about is that it should have a purpose. It should not be busy work because you're wasting your time, you're wasting their time. Make sure that the active learning strategy is not just basic recall. It could be, but it needs to be more really taking it and working with it. Involving them, having them do something meaningful. Do ones that you're comfortable doing. If you're not an active person, do ones that are not active. Don't make yourself uncomfortable and worry about not doing things well. Do the ones you're comfortable doing. And then plan it. Don't just go and say, okay, let's do this, and you haven't worked with it and planned it in advance. So all of these tips and many more are on that planning sheet. So when you have a chance, go back, think about what we've talked about today, see if you can start planning an activity based on what we've talked about, incorporating what we've talked about, and using that little planning sheet, okay? And I'd be happy to chat with y'all about it too.